This week we'll be thinking about two things in our thought for the week about journeys and about dragons, mainly in the difficulties of rural ministry. We're going to talk a little bit about journeys. Dragons are not quite so relevant in that situation. So journeys in the countryside can be affected by all sorts of things, some in similar ways to those in urban environments and others quite different ways. So we have in particular had a lot of flooding both through March recently and in places where I have previously lived. Either you need to have an awareness of if a rural road is flooding or is liable to flood, what that will mean for you and your journey. It might mean that you choose to go an entirely different way, or sometimes if you have one available to you, you might take a different vehicle. So those are things that we think about. Flooding had a particular route that had a propensity to flood in one particular place where I worked previously. I always had to make the decision, do I set off on the long way round straight away, or do I think I will be able to drive through that flood when I get there? That was always an issue. Animals are a different issue in the countryside, of course. So we often have cows. Once came across cows in a lane whilst I was on my bicycle. I turned round and left the cows to have ownership of that particular lane. You might come across sheep in the lane and the roads, either escaped or being moved, of course. Deer are a real problem. Whale deer, because if they become entangled with a car, then that's really dangerous for both the deer and the occupants of the car. I still think the strangest thing I found on the road was a baby owl who had obviously not long fledged. He was still very fluffy. I was driving down a lane just after dusk and stopped, and the baby owl was just looking at me and I was just looking at the baby owl. It took him a minute or two to realise that he probably ought to move out of the way, and he did, and it was all good. There are also encounters with humans. I mean, some people will stop and have a chat in the countryside if they meet someone coming the other way and they need to speak to them. That is absolutely fine. That happens. You just hang on and wait until they've discussed what they needed to discuss. And cyclists, I respect cyclists. I think they have a right to cycle, of course, but it can be tricky on Sunday mornings when the vicar is trying to hurry from one church service to the other. Then oftentimes have to wait till it's safe to pass a cyclist in a lane. So you just have to be relaxed and think, well, I'll get there when I get there. The other thing about journeys in the countryside is that they can be more seasonal. So of course in the winter you can have snow and rain and flooding and all those things as well. But you're also very in touch with the seasons as the trees change, as the fields change, as you see things coming into flower in the hedgerows. It's a very seasonal thing to do, to journey around the countryside. So urban traffic can be really bad, can have all sorts of different problems, but in the countryside can have unexpected surprises in lanes, but also journeys which are very much rooted into a sense of season. Our thought for the week this week is about journeys and about dragons, because we have the two things going on that we remember in this time. We have the Bible reading of the road to Emmaus, which is from Luke 24, and we have St. George's Day. So we're going to think a little bit about those and about journeys and about dragons. So what happens with the disciples on the road to Emmaus? They leave Jerusalem and they're going to Emmaus, and they are very confused about what has been going on. There's been some talk about resurrection. They don't really know what it all means. They're really frightened, and they're in that kind of cycle of grief and disorientation that you would expect them to have, having been through such a trauma. As they're walking along the road, a stranger meets them and joins up with them, and they talk to him about it, and he explains all the things that Jesus had been trying to explain to them before he died, explaining what was going to happen with the resurrection and all those sorts of things. When they get to Emmaus, the stranger makes as if they're going to go on, and they say, no, come back with us, come and have some hospitality with us. It's nearly dark, so stay, have a meal, stay with us. So the stranger does, and as the stranger gives thanks for the meal, breaks the bread, the disciples really suddenly realise that it's Jesus who is there with them, and then when they recognise him, he kind of disappears. And what the disciples do is they run back to Jerusalem in the dark to tell everybody that they have seen Jesus. So that's what they do. George, a saint, a believer. We know about him that he was a Roman soldier. We know that he is from Turkey, from Cappadocia, and that he died in Lydda in the Roman province of Syria, which is now Lod in Israel, on April the 23rd, 303, so 1720 years ago. It was part of the Diocletian persecutions. They were really awful persecutions, those Diocletian persecutions. Anyway, George was brave. He was a Roman soldier who wouldn't renounce his faith, and so he was martyred. Then the stories about him start to grow up, and quite a long time later there are the stories about him, and people chose to think about George, a soldier, a brave person, a brave Christian, with the story about a dragon. Now, dragons have all sorts of bad press or good press, depending on what you feel about dragons, but in ancient Near Eastern cultures, dragons and leviathans were associated with chaos and with those things which couldn't be controlled. And even in the Bible we have stories which talk about leviathans. There are dragons in that sort of understanding of chaos, and then they moved into fiction as being something which is dangerous and difficult, a dragon to be deceived, a dragon which could be an enemy, and then on top of that we have the association of Satan with images of dragons and so on. Admittedly, there are some rehabilitated dragons. In fact, if you think about training your dragon, all those sorts of things, but the dragons are often associated with this danger and persecution. The story is something along the lines that George finds himself in a town which is being persecuted by a dragon, which is coming from the sea and demanding sacrifices. They appease it with sheep. And then when it's not happy with sheep anymore, they appease it with human sacrifices. And just as the dragon is about to eat the princess or some other human person of note, then George kills the dragon with his lance. So that is the story that people wanted to write about George, who is a brave military saint. That's their understanding of who George was, who he would be, who he represented, that defeat of the dragon. In maps, when people didn't really understand where something was or what was in between a place, there's a kind of myth arising that they would write "Here be dragons" on the map, so that people would know that that was a place where they needed to be afraid, that it was a fearful place and there was something strange going on there. And it may be that people just didn't understand what was happening. It could be that there were like whales there, or possibly even walruses, but that kind of understanding, the way they wanted to talk about their fear in a particular place, was to write "Here be dragons." When the disciples are walking from Emmaus to Jerusalem, they have taken their own dragon of fear with them. They have taken it, and they need to be aware of what's going on. They are fearful. They are disorientated in that way that grief-stricken people are disorientated and they're walking, and it is as if for them that road had "Here be dragons" written either side of it. They're frightened and confused and they don't know what's going on, and they encounter Jesus. And he doesn't so much kill their dragon as dismember their dragon of fear and show them that they don't need to be afraid anymore. They don't need to be fearful. So this is what happens. When they get there, they recognize Jesus. And they say how our hearts were burning as he spoke to us on the road. They recognized that there was something, that their fear was being lifted away from them. And we know that they weren't afraid anymore, that the "Here be dragons" either side of the road between Emmaus and Jerusalem are gone, because they run back in the dark. And they wouldn't have run back in the dark if they were still frightened. We don't know how far it was. It's either probably 7 miles or 18 miles. I think if you're going to run back, 7 miles seems more reasonable, but there you go. They run back to Jerusalem and tell the others, and they tell them that the fear has gone. The fear that they were taking with them, their concern, their dragon of fear, is not to be feared anymore. Jesus meets a lot of people in this period between Easter and the Ascension. He talks to them, he meets them, he brings them peace. This particular couple, he quells their fear, he takes their concerns away. Jesus explains how his death and resurrection have made the way to God possible. He talks about what that means for people and how they don't need to be afraid anymore. And that's a really good thing for us to remember in this time after Easter, that we don't need to be frightened of dragons of fear or concern, that Jesus has the victory over those concerns for us. And that's a really good thing for us to remember in this season. So the Dibley moment of the week this week is to do with journeys, and it's to do with when we moved many years ago from a big city to a place in the country which was tucked away at the back of beyond. When I gave people instructions about how to find this house, I would say go past this particular pub and then carry on along the lane until you think you've reached the end of the world, and then go on a bit further and then you'll find this next landmark. So as we were giving the moving people instructions of how to bring our lorry load of stuff from our old house in the big city to our new house in the depths of the countryside, I really said, would you like me to draw you a map and give you instructions about how to find our house? And they were really dismissive. They said, no, don't do that. We don't need that. We'll know where it is. And yeah, that's where we left it. And I said, well, phone when you get lost and we'll sort you out. So they were a bit late on the actual day that we were expecting the lorry with all our things on it, and I was in the new house keeping an eye out for them. And I saw the lorry go past and I thought, oh, okay. And then I saw the person from whom we were renting this house go past. I said, I think our moving men have just gone past. Can you please just turn them round if you see them? And he drove past, and then a few minutes later the phone rang, and it was the moving men going, well, how do we get to you? And I said, well, you need to do this and you need to turn around somehow and come back. So they managed to do that, and they arrived at our house, and they didn't mention speaking to this other person who'd driven past them at all. After they'd left and everything was in the house, I got a visit from this person who they lived next door, and they came out and said, I did speak to your moving men, but I couldn't understand what they were saying, and I don't think they could understand me either, so we couldn't help each other. So yeah, that's a story of getting lost in the countryside and of people with very strong city accents from a particular place just not understanding people with their country accents in a different place. I don't know if it would happen now, but certainly the 20 years ago when we moved there, that actually happened. They just didn't understand the farmer and he didn't understand the moving men. That's it for the Dibley Diaries for this week, and I pray that you and your village, however large or small, remote or well connected, have a really blessed week.